Aloha, everyone, and good afternoon. And thank you for joining us for the 40th Annual Hawaii International Film Festival presented by Halekulani. And this afternoon's Film for Thought discussion, a conversation with director Ursula Liang. My name is Anna Page. I'm the director of programming at the festival, and I'm really honored to open and present this talk to you this afternoon. Ursula Liang is the director of Down a Dark Stairwell, which is part of our Film for Thought series at the Hawaii International Film Festival in partnership with the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. This is a really incredible program that combines thought-provoking film with scholarly and cultural-based discussions, and we're really excited to be able to include this film and this discussion as part of the program this year. Again, a big mahalo to Hawaii Council for the Humanities. Also, a big mahalo to all of our sponsors, board of directors, and members at HIFF for all of their support in helping make HIFF happen. Last but not least, we are still having our HIFF Audience Award this year. So if you would like to vote for this film for the Audience Award, you can go to hawaiinewsnow.com/HIFF to vote. And if you have, for some reason, not gotten a chance to watch this film yet, or the other films in our Film for Thought series, please definitely check those out online, streaming all the way until the 29th. Again, this is a really important and thought-provoking film. As soon as myself and the programming team watched the film this year, we knew that it was a perfect fit for this year's Film for Thought discussion. Down a Dark Stairwell faces the conflict between Chinese American and Black communities in the wake of Akai Gurley's murder by New York City police officer Peter Liang. Ursula Liang has worked for many important media organizations, including the New York Times OpDocs, Asia Pacific Forum on WBAI and Hyphen Magazine, and currently freelances as a film and television producer. 1 October, Third Act, Gloves Off, UFC Countdown, and UFC Primetime. And she is a story consultant. She is a member of Film Fatales, A-Doc, and sits on the executive board of Brown Girls Doc Mafia. Liang grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, and lives in the Bronx in New York. Her debut feature, Nine Man, was broadcast on public television and called an absorbing documentary by the New York Times. Her latest film, Down a Dark Stairwell, had its premiere at True False Film Festival and was called A Vital Picture of a Tumultuous Time by Vox. Our scholar for today's discussion, Danielle Seed, is an assistant professor of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where she teaches courses in film, media, and narrative studies. Some of her research areas include Asian American film and media history, trans representation, TV genre and feminism, and the histories of race and moviegoing. In her research, she aims to continue the work begun by her Chinese American immigrant grandparents, who produced a documentary entitled Forever Chinatown in 1960 and nurtured Chinese American film community in Southern California. We are really looking forward to a deep conversation about film that looks courageously into issues that matter to our communities and provide opportunities for us as a community to talk more about the meaning of these stories. A big aloha and welcome to our speakers today. And thank you, Aiko, for passing on your notes. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Danielle and Ursula.
Mahalo nui, Anna, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so sorry we couldn't hear from Aiko there. But I want to mahalo Aiko, Shannon, and Liz at the Hawaii Council for the Humanities for all their work in organizing today's event. And I want to send a big aloha and mahalo to everyone who has taken the time to be here today for our discussion, wherever you may be in the world. On a personal note, I've just returned to Hawaii after having been away for the last 8 years. And coming back to Oahu, one of the things I was most excited about being involved with is HIFF, which is such a vital cultural institution here in Hawaii and the broader Pacific. So before I forget, I want to extend a big congratulations to HIFF on its 40th year anniversary. As Anna mentioned, my name is Danielle Seed, and I'm a professor of English here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where I specialize in film and media studies. with particular attention to racial representations in film and television, Asian American filmmaking, and minority viewing communities, whether by race and ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. For these reasons and more, I am very excited to be in discussion today with filmmaker Ursula Liang, director most recently of Down a Dark Stairwell, which I hope you have all had a chance to see or will go and see shortly after our discussion today. I also want to encourage you to go and see Ursula's first film, 9 Man, from 2014, which incidentally screened here at HIFF. 9 Man is a wonderful film about a Chinatown sporting tradition, Asian American masculinities, and so much more. And it was really 9 Man that first made me a fan of Ursula's work. The theme of the Film for Thought series this year is change makers. And there's no doubt in my mind that, especially with Down a Dark Stairwell, Ursula will be talked about and viewed as a change maker. After my first viewing of the film, I was immediately struck by how different this film is from quote unquote traditional Asian American documentaries in its subject matter, in its perhaps very critical view of an Asian American community, and its different take on the question of representation. In my view, the film performs a kind of reaching out for a horizontal politics in which communities really listen to one another and walk side by side, rejecting the racial hierarchies that exist under white supremacy. We live in a time when we so often receive images of police violence and murder that really make us feel helpless. Last night I rewatched Down a Dark Stairwell, and it really is a devastating film. But for me, the film does not leave you feeling helpless. It's about agency and people taking action in pursuit of justice. This is a powerful, urgent, and incredibly timely film in this moment of heightened attention to police violence and mass movements for racial and social justice, especially following the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. Down a Dark Stairwell is willing to ask very tough questions and get in the trenches, so to speak, with communities that are not often thought of together and is sharing history or concerns or working toward a collective liberation. So with that, I want to turn to my first question for Ursula, but first I want to say congratulations on the making of this film. I want to start with a very general question, Ursula, and that is why this film and why this story? Did you feel a calling to tell this story, and how did that process unfold?
Bill, you used the exact right language. I did feel like a calling at some point. Folks may notice that I have the same last name as the police officer in the film. We are not related, but I do have a brother named Peter. So when I heard of this incident, I was really keyed onto it right away. It was 4 months after the killing of Eric Garner in New York City, and I live here in New York City. And so this was all very like present in everyone's minds. And then, of course, we start reading news and we start seeing, as soon as you see an Asian last name in the paper, you know that it sort of opens a new conversation. And, you know, so many films and so many conversations about race in America happen in this very, like, in the specific binary. It's usually black, white, and if it's not black, white, it's something else than white. And so I thought this film was a really good opportunity to center our communities, because I think there's a lot that we need to talk about together.
And so much has happened. Obviously, so much has happened from 2014 to now, especially in terms of organizing, the movement for Black Lives chiefly. And I'm wondering, did you plan for this film to come out now? It's incredibly timely coming out in 2020. And does it take on a different character? Is it sort of altered or enhanced by its emergence 5-6 years after the killing of Akai Gurley?
Yeah, I mean, no, we absolutely did not intend for it to come out in this moment, and especially in this moment where there's so much upheaval around the same topic. The bulk of the film was actually filmed in 2016, because that's when the court case happened. Things happen very slowly in the American justice system, and so sort of that was where we started kicking off filming in earnest. And We did intend to film, definitely complete a year earlier, but, fundraising and figuring out like a very complicated story just took way longer than we thought. And so when we did emerge, our first screening was in March of this year, right? As I think our premiere was like either the 8th or the 6th of March. And, by the 12th, the country was shut down. And so it was a very strange time to be releasing the film. And then shortly thereafter, Ahmaud Arbery news started hitting. And, I guess in some ways, I think I'm really glad that people are finding this to be like a really resonant film in this moment. But I think, one of the things that Akai Gurley's family members always talked about when they decided that they were willing to do interviews with me is that this case was actually pretty small on the scale of sort of Black Lives Matter cases. Akai Gurley's name didn't get as much attention as some of the other cases. And it's partially because of the circumstances of this case. It's not as clear a case of police brutality where you're seeing on camera somebody actually seeing a Black man and doing something violent to them. It's a lot more obtuse. And so I think the media and also the organizers didn't latch onto this case as much. And so one of their primary objectives in speaking to me was to make sure that his name was elevated and remembered. And I think I always knew that I was trying to make a film that would have some longevity because they do take so long to make. Sorry, I live in New York City on a noisy street, and it's police sirens and various other things all up and down the street all the time. And it's only two of us, so I can only mute myself so often. But yeah, I'd hoped to make a film with some longevity that would have like new resonance, depending on what was happening in the world. And to be honest, when we were coming out, there was a moment where it was like a Crazy Rich Asians moment, where there was like a lot of attention being paid to like Asian representation on screen. And just strategically, we were like, oh, I wish the film was ready now because people are looking for Asian-driven content. And then there was Charlottesville. And we actually feel like that moment at Charlottesville had a lot to do with what's happening in this film, where we're sort of seeing the rise of various cultural nationalisms in our country. And it felt like this could also be a conversation we were having with this film. And then, of course, right on the nose, when this film is released, there's like a huge resurgence of Black Lives Matter activism. And so I guess when these cases were coming out that are so egregious, like the George Floyd case, that really ignited the nation and really turned people, I think the public opinion very cleanly towards the movement. I felt like, does this case feel small, and does the story feel small? But I think there's still always a conversation for us to be for us to have amongst each other that's not being had in sort of these greater dialogues. So I'm hoping that people still find the film relevant and find like a special nuance to the conversation that stands out from the other stories.
Yeah, that's great. I imagine that they will. And I want to ask you about Asian American representation and Asian American audiences, assuming that Asian American audiences are going to be one of the major audiences for the film, right? There's a sign that one of the demonstrators is holding in the film that says, "Whose side are you on?" And it's also a chant that comes back, right, outside of the courthouse at the end of the film. And I've been thinking a lot about that question. It almost in a way seems too simple, right? I want to reject binaries, but there are situations that really force us to choose sides, so to speak. And so I guess what I like about that question is that it does force a kind of self-reckoning or self-reflection. And I wonder, in making the film, how you thought about objectivity, maintaining kind of objective gaze as you cut between these communities who come to head at the end of the film. Because from where I'm sitting, there is a kind of critical view of the Chinese American community in the film, and yet by and large the film does maintain objectivity. So how did you approach that, maintaining that balance?
Well, it's objectivity is a bit of a fallacy, but I was striving for some type of objectivity. I come from a background in journalism, and part of me thinks that change is most effective when it comes from within. And so audiences, when they can figure things out on their own and they can see both sides of the story and make a judgment, that it's a much more meaningful commitment to their thought process. And so I think that, I think a lot of films nowadays are being made in sort of an advocacy mode where they're following one point of view and they may, have a little note to the other side. But I think it's important to lay out all the arguments so that people can really see what's there. That said, we're working with hundreds of hours of footage and hundreds of story points, and it's just being distilled into something very specific. But it was very clear in the beginning that I wanted to elevate the voices of Asian and Black folks in the film. And so we didn't interview any white people. Our crew was largely Black and Asian. And so there were a lot of checks and balances in the filmmaking process. And that included screening for a lot of people and having a question on our screening questionnaire that literally says which way do you think the film leans, and sort of adjusting our edit a little bit. And when you're editing a film, it's not about 50-50. It's not about the time on camera being equal, but it's about sort of emotional content and how it weighs against each other and charisma. Some people are much more charismatic on screen. So there was a lot of balancing that we did in the edit, and it just took a long time. But I have two editors on the project. One is Chinese American, and one is as a Black man. And so it was really interesting in that process to work through the story with both of them.
That's great. Super interesting. And you can tell that this film is really made in the editing. In terms of Asian American audiences, there's a lot of sophisticated conversations in the film. What I really appreciated were the moments when, for example, Chinese Americans are sitting, around a table in a Chinese restaurant, really making historically informed, arguments and hashing out some of these really difficult issues, talking about politics and ideology. And I also really, really appreciated when we were in that organizing space with the organizers and activists who were supporting Akai Gurley's family, that there was a discussion about model minorityism, and how it's a product of white supremacy. Again, these are really sophisticated, important discussions to be having. I found that really generative. And I'm wondering, for Asian American audiences, what conversations do you hope they'll have leaving this film? What is it that you hope they continue to talk about?
That's a good question. I mean, we did have a lot of different audiences in mind as we were making the film. And I think each individual member of the audience is going to have their own baggage and thought process they bring to a film. So it's going to depend. But, we did a lot of work in the film to draw parallels, not to draw equivalencies, but even just in simple visual language, we were trying to, there are a lot of scenes where you see people walking up and down stairs, and it's sort of just to underline the fact that there was an everydayness of, even if he's in the hood, if he's in a dangerous place, he's walking down the stairs of his home. And actually, I do that every day, and I didn't really associate that with what Akai was doing at that moment when he got shot until I thought about it a lot. So we did things like that where we were building visual imagery to build a little bit of a connection, because I think that's part of the thing that's lacking. We're living in these spaces, and the Black community and the Asian community are both very isolated culturally, especially in New York. That has a lot to do with, for the scholars in the room, has a lot to do with racist legislation and history, why we're in these segregated communities. But everyone thinks New York City is a big melting pot, but look at the neighborhoods. They're very segregated and culturally segregated. And we're also living in a world where social media bubbles support that and encourage that. So I think part of it was drawing a lot of parallels through the film. I mean, we obviously, I don't have any kind of hope that the film will make dramatic change and turn everybody's mind. But I do think that we have to see that we have parallel goals, even if we don't agree on this case, even if we don't agree on any of the specifics of any of the issues going forward, we do have things that we all care about. And just to sort of think about those things and how we can align to work towards common goals, I think is important.
Yeah, that's great. And your mention of some of the visual language or grammar that you used made me think of a shot where I think there are two popoas walking up the stairs, coming out of the subway. And that made me think about the anti-Asian racism that we've seen, right, in the context of the pandemic. And now we have a movement, They Can't Burn Us All, I believe it's called, right? that was spurred by this attack on a older, I think she was around 90, right? Chinese American woman. So yeah, I can see now some of these visual techniques, and I really appreciate it. I want to also ask you about some of the gender dimensions and issues in the film. I was really struck by how particularly gendered the spaces in these organizing communities felt. To me, that is that the organizing around justice for Kai Gurley skewed really younger and female, whereas with the Chinatown leaders who rallied behind Peter Liang, it definitely skewed older and toward men. And I'm wondering if you were surprised by that, or if you were thinking about gender as you approach the telling of this story.
I mean, I think we definitely noticed what you noticed. But we also did start filming a little bit later in the game. We weren't there at the very beginning. So one of the things we were very conscious of when we were interviewing, particularly like the Akai Gurley side, I mean, I think we should give all credit. Black women are the leaders of a lot of movements in this country for liberation. But there were more male organizers in the beginning, Black male organizers. And we felt, as we were making the film, I really felt an absence of Black men. We were interviewing the people that were actively involved in leading things at that moment when we started filming. But we knew that those voices would be really important. So you'll also see in the film these street scenes where we really just approach men on the street and ask them to give input. And they were not part of the organizing. They were not part of the movement, but we really felt like we needed those voices because we couldn't tell a story about the killing of a Black man without having Black male voices. And, I did make a film in Chinatown, 9 Man, which was really like largely centered on men in Chinatown. And, I was sort of, the movement did have a little bit of gender balance in smaller spaces, but but you're right. It was, observationally, it felt very male. And, I think there's a lot in our culture that sort of leans towards that in both cultures, right? You could go for the Black community, you can go to like the availability of, there's so many Black men in prison because of unfair prison policies or law enforcement policies that there are just fewer people. And there's a lot of gender bias in the Asian American community. I don't know if that's what it is. I mean, the moment that you were talking about around the dinner table, that was a pretty 50-50 kind of male-female kind of Chinatown meal. But, the speakers on the podium often were men. And it was there were a lot of folks that were involved in this moment that seemed to have political aspirations that went beyond this. And so the folks that were, elevating themselves to the podium were often men. So yes, we didn't think too much about the gender in the making of the film, other than making sure that we highlighted the Black male voices because we thought that was essential.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up racialized masculinities, because as a scholar, I sort of, want to take it apart and really look at how Black masculinities and Asian American masculinities are, of course, they're, represented in media in a way that, we hear about racialized tropes that are harmful. And we hear that it's a very common refrain now to hear that representation matters. But I think in your film, you kind of see the real life consequences of these ideas that people have, right, about Black masculinity and about Asian American masculinity. And in 9 Man, you're really sort of exploring a space, it felt to me like a space where Asian American men, Chinese American men could, express their masculinity in a positive way. And I wonder if I could just push a little further on this question of Asian American masculinity in this film, because it's a different take, right? It's a sort of different look at Asian American masculinity, maybe more as it sort of fits into white institutions. It's sort of more pressed upon.
I haven't really, this is the first time I've been asked that question, but yes, I think the backdrop of this is that I'm super interested in masculinity and how it underlies a lot in this country. The Black men in America are adultified, or whatever the word is, where, it's, Peter and Akai were about the same age, and they were similar life circumstances too. So it was interesting to see those parallels. There's always the tendency to criminalize the Black male. And then in this case, there was the there was a lot being done. And I think this was strategic on like the legal side to sort of, I don't want to say infantilize Peter, but to soften him a little bit so that he wouldn't look so criminal in the court case. So, I mean, I don't know if I could make a big sweeping comment about masculinities on the sort of Asian protesting side, but I mean, the reality is, I think that some of that is the backdrop for some of the motivation for the folks that protested on behalf of Peter, which is this sort of constant sense of not ever being able to have like a voice, not ever being able to like, I'm glad you mentioned the anti-Asian bias that's happening right now. It's, there are so many things that happen to our community that are not allowed to be vocalized because on the scale of this hierarchy of trauma, it never really compares. And so I think there's a form of emasculation that is like being voiceless and having like less political power. And so if we're sort of, I'm not so sure it's like on the nose masculinity stuff, but it's, that's what a lot of Asian American men are dealing with in this country, and rightly should be fighting for more empowerment in those spaces. And so just to feel like that, to feel like Peter was the person that was taking the fall for the much more egregious cases of other incidents made them feel like the system is, if we let this one go by, the system is going to keep doing this to us, and we're going to feel less and less powerful in this country. So I think that was some of the motivation for a lot of these folks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we really have to take seriously this question of a kind of besieged Asian American masculinity, right? I mean, there is a lot of racial grievance on the Chinese American side, and for good reason. But it's important that we also pay attention to these gender dimensions. And earlier you mentioned cultural nationalisms. It's kind of hard not to see that when you see these, thousands of people out in support of Peter Liang, and the leaders, again, older men, and all of the American flags. It does sort of, I hate to say it, but reek of a kind of Asian American cultural nationalism that's very masculinized. And so I know I'll be thinking a lot about it, and I'll be bringing these questions and issues to my students, because I definitely plan to teach the film. And I want to ask you about the film as an educational tool and resource. And I've also talked with other friends and colleagues who are excited to include the film on their syllabi and start teaching it. And I think that not just for college instructors, but the film is going to be useful for community organizers, for instance. Right? Trying to do this work of multiracial coalition building is incredibly difficult. And maybe also high school teachers, right, where ethnic studies classes are being taught. So I want to know if you perhaps did research for the film that you think people who watch the film and want to continue learning should go and look at, or maybe what else people should watch or read to have a better understanding of the issues that are explored in the film.
It just warms my heart for you to say anything about teaching. Like that really, you sort of kill yourself to make a film, and to know that it's gonna be amplified in that way is really meaningful for the process of, to keep us going as filmmakers. I think there are going to be folks that don't like the film, and I really hope that they use the film to point out what they don't like, and use it in a movement to push things forward regardless. We do actually have a plan to do some educational work with it. It's going to have like some sort of educational release, but the film will be on PBS next spring, and I believe there will be a discussion guide that goes along with it. And so a lot of the legwork has not been done with that, but I'm thinking and like taking little notes on the side about things that I think would be interesting to pair with it. I think that I did a panel the other day with John Ridley and this amazing filmmaker who did a film, Love Song for Latasha, which is on Netflix right now. It's a 15-minute film, and that is a film about Latasha Harlins, who people really know as the person that was killed right before the LA uprising, LA riots. And it's just a beautiful film. And I think that's another film that sort of involves the Black and Asian community. And I think that's an interesting one to watch. There's also Grace Lee did a great like interactive thing with PBS that is about LA as well. And it's like hundreds of hours of stuff you can choose your own adventure on and like see original interviews with Korean American shopkeepers, et cetera. So some of those things I think are interesting things to, if you're planning like a curriculum around this kind of work. Obviously there's a lot of like historical stuff that you could pair, but I think when we're, we another great thing that's happening with PBS is they're translating into Chinese for us. So I think there are a lot of folks that are going to want to share the film with their parents who are less English proficient, and that's going to be a great resource for them. And I think there'll be a plan really, I think that there's in some of the movement work, I think it's important for this film to be screened for monocultural groups and sometimes for groups together. So I think, I'm hoping the film will bring together with people with dumplings and discussions at some point, but also I think there's some folks that would benefit more from being in an all Asian or an all Black or a mixed group. So to think about how you're presenting it, I think is very valuable.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad it warms your heart. I can assure you that this film, that people who study Asian American film and media will be teaching it. And I'll send you my ideas for what to pair the film with. And yeah, it's wonderful to hear too that it's going to screen in Chinese and reach those communities. We are open to questions from audience members. So jump in if you have responses to the film or questions about the film, or we can just keep talking, and we can keep talking until those questions come in. So I guess I'm wondering where we go from here, right? As I said at the start of this talk, I think there's a kind of reaching for a horizontal politics, right? Where these communities really do listen to one another in a non-hierarchical way, where they have autonomy and self-management. And I'm wondering where we go from here, right? With either this issue of policing, we've seen other organizing and activism here in Hawaii recently, last year, most significantly, the protests at Mauna Kea. And I think there are reasons to feel hopeful. And yet, this work is just incredibly challenging. And I don't think the issue of policing and police violence is going away anytime soon, because inequality is not going away anytime soon, right? What are your thoughts? Are you feeling hopeful about this kind of multiracial coalition?
Well, I'm always pretty optimistic, even though I'm a negative talker in some ways. I wish I had a prescription and had a phone number for everyone to dial and to donate to, and it'll solve all our problems. But I think a lot of the conversations I've been had are about sort of, one of the things we've tried to do with the film is sort of dial the volume down a little bit. Obviously there was a lot of emotion around this case and people were screaming at each other in the streets. And when that happens, you can't listen to each other. So we wanted to give people the opportunity to hear in a little bit more quiet moments what the thought processes were. And I appreciate that you highlighted sort of the intelligence behind all that organizing, because a lot of people think that people just flood into the streets, like these dum-dums flood into the streets and are just yelling things. But there's a lot of strategy behind all this work, and it's very thoughtful, and it's very interesting to see how that type of planning sort of ignites movements. I think that we need, so dialing down the volume is part of the process. And I think creating safe spaces almost for the expression of trauma, and whether again, these are combined spaces or unicultural spaces. I think we need to have safe spaces where people can really discuss really freely and I think there's one thing about our community, I think, is that there's a lot for us to learn. We don't have as much history in organizing. Some small groups do, but we're going to make a lot of mistakes, especially the newer immigrants. And so, I think All Lives Matter is a great example of that there's still, there's a need. I think some of our community really needs to be met at a different place and are not able to come to the center right now and hear all this beautiful language and that's been developed around these movements of, defund the police, white supremacy. All these are really big concepts. So I think it's about taking a little bit of time to bring down the volume, taking a little bit of time to meet people where they are and to create safe spaces. And I think that's where we're going to get sort of some larger movements built to bring into sort of a solidarity space.
That's really great. And we do, as someone who teaches Asian American media and Asian American history, we do have those legacies of organizing, right, in our history. We might have to go back a little further, right? Some of the first organizing around immigration was done by Chinese Americans, protesting the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah, and I think that's, when we think about like educating with this film, we think those are things that the Black community should know, like, there were Asian American Black Panthers, like that. You should know that we have been here at points. And I think that, clearly in the film, you see like, you see Asian Americans misusing like language of the civil rights movement. There's some learning that needs to go back the other way. So yes, I mean, absolutely. I don't mean to say that we haven't been there all along, because there are definitely people in the film that would hate for that to be part of it. But there, I think one thing that people who know Asian Americans and the history of the immigration of Asian Americans to America see that in this film, a lot of that is there. You see the folks that have been here for 5 generations, and they're in a very different place politically than the folks who have got here 20 years ago. So all those waves of immigration and that kind of history is very interesting to like parse in this story.
Questions are coming in, at least a few from my colleagues. So there's a question about, you mentioned Crazy Rich Asians, making this movie around the same time that Crazy Rich Asians came out. And so the question is, how do you see the movie addressing or intervening in the forms of Asian media that have started to gain more cultural prominence?
In the forms? Well, I mean, I really appreciate that you felt like this film felt different than other Asian American stories. I mean, it's, I'm really interested in, I think most audiences are interested in flawed characters and nuance and grit. And I think our community has so little representation in the media that they're very interested in very polished presentations of who we are. And so I think the film speaks to that. I mean, another thing, it just like simply existing with different types of Asian Americans, those that are funny and have like New York accents, and those that are coming from Hong Kong and all that stuff sort of adds a texture to folks who don't have access at all to the Asian American community. Just to see them behave in different ways in the film is sort of a backdrop for that. And so I think, I do believe this film is like very complicated, has a lot in it, but I think there's always a goal of mine to have some very simple things that audiences that are not that engaged with the nuance will see. And if it's just unpacking some of the stereotypes of the communities, I think that's valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. See lots of different Asian American films, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just Crazy Rich Asians, but Asian American documentaries, and ones that tackle difficult subjects. There's a question about justice and whether justice can really be achieved through the courts. It seems to be foreclosed on at the end of the film, right? And I think it was maybe Kirby, the organizer, said, if we're gonna achieve justice, it's gonna happen here in the community and not through the courts. I mean, it is devastating, right? Because this is after what feels like a major loss for those organizers. What do you think about this question of justice in the courts?
I mean, I think there's some truth in what she says, and something I learned a lot in making the film. I'm not a full-time organizer, and even just learning the language that they use, they don't use the word, criminal justice system anymore, because that's so loaded. They say sort of American legal system or various other, or criminal American system or whatever it is. There's like various other ways to say it, but things do feel pretty broken. And, I think that's why we're at a point in this country where abolish is like a key word, where people think we need to start anew and we need to start fresh, because adding so many Band-Aids over so many years is really not helping. It's also interesting because I think that there's a weird like tension in this film, because a lot of the folks that are, fighting for Peter's heavy conviction and heavy sentencing are also people who are part of the movements for like the abolishment of prison and things like that. So it's like there are folks that don't believe in prison and don't believe that prison is the way to like reform or help the society, but they're also fighting for the harshest possible prison punishment for Peter because he's a police officer. And it's, there's not something we could totally get into in the film, but the DA is a Black man who ran on like a justice platform, and his feeling and his recommendation was to give Peter no jail time because he was a person who was not like a cop with a long history of complaints. He he didn't think that this man would be a danger to society if he was on the streets again, not as a police officer. And so, the community and the Black community and the organizers were so pained by that recommendation. But that there's, the question is, was he right in some ways? I don't know. Some people might think that he was right, and that Peter got the appropriate punishment. There's some positive things about this film, was that this was a case where there was an actual conviction. So the system did work in some ways in this case, where he did something, according to some folks, or he did something, he was actually convicted for it. The sentencing is where people really diverge. But the jurors were by and large white males. There was a little bit of diversity on the jury, and they had been influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversation of the past couple of years before they went into deliberation. And and this was kind of a first, that somebody actually was held to some level accountable for what they did.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And I think we also have to look at representation. I mentioned that I see your film as kind of, staking a different kind of claim about representation almost. And in this case, we see other Asian Americans in the system, right? There's an Asian American judge,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not just Peter Liang. And I think even a bailiff, right? We see other Asian Americans represented in the system. And so again, this refrain that representation matters, your film really puts pressure on this question of, okay, why does representation matter? What's really happening in this system? The folks organizing around the movement for Black Lives are looking for material gains, right? Actual changes to the system, not just adding, a multiracial face to the NYPD, for example. And the NYPD has every reason to want to have a multiracial police force, right?
They made it very clear to me that they were not after Peter as a Chinese American police officer, that they really do not they see that blue and that badge before anything else. And so, I think it's been a little difficult because the film is often framed in a way that it's sort of two communities fighting against each other, which obviously there's a guilty, not guilty binary in the film. But I think that both sides would really, had moments where they were really protesting this being seen as a race war and sort of fighting against that. But, this is America, and there are realities to how everything looks. And neither one of us are minorities that can pass. You know what I mean? We are visible minorities everywhere we go. And so just seeing people on different sides with different faces gets people in that mode right away.
Yeah. I think we've just about come to the end of our question and answer period. I thank everyone for showing up with questions. I mean, there's still obviously so much more to discuss about the film. So continue the discussion, tell people about the film, have these discussions in your community, whether that's an Asian American community or another kind of community. And yeah, so any blowback, we have maybe just 1 minute, any blowback from stakeholders? Question.
That's from Anderson, the amazing human being who programmed both Nine Man and this film. Big shout out to Anderson. It's kind of interesting because there are some parallels with my last film and this film. There are actually a couple like overlapping characters. There, one watched it yesterday or the day before and saw himself in it. He had not realized he was at it, that he was going to be appearing at a podium in DC. So no, I mean in general. The film has had a little bit of a soft release because of COVID, so not everyone's seen it. And I don't, I haven't. I mean, I think the community is not like actively like seeking to confront me about anything in online. It was actually, Nine Man was actually an access point for building this film. There's several other characters that are in it that are shared. But my relationships from having been in the community for 7 years got me introductions to some of the folks on the Chinese American side. And so it's interesting to see. And we also used, Chops, the composer from the last film. He composed the end track. So if you guys are watching it and haven't watched it yet, make sure you stay for the credits, because that is an original song that was composed by Chops, and the rapper is Kai Gurley's good friend. So that was written for the film. Anyway, yeah, no blowback yet, but once this gets a little bit wider, maybe, and I'll report back to you, Anderson. Thanks again for having the film here.
Aloha, everyone. I'm so sorry. We've come to the end of our time today. I just want to extend thank you so much again, Ursula, for being with us today. And thank you so much, Danielle, for hosting this really engaging discussion. I know that we did not get to everybody's question just because we are on a tight time frame today. However, the panelists will try and answer your questions by typing into the Q&A box while we wrap up here for those couple of questions that didn't get answered. Again, as a reminder, my name's Anna. I'm the Director of Programming at HIFF, and I just want to, in addition to thanking Danielle and Ursula for having this discussion with us today, I want to extend another really big mahalo to the Hawaii Council for the Humanities for putting together these conversations during the festival this week, especially their team Aiko, Liz, and Shannon, who've really worked very hard on the program this year. This is the last of our Film for Thought discussions during the festival. However, you can view all of them available now on our HIFF Facebook page. And you can also watch them if you are in the streaming app watching the films. You can watch the Q&As directly in the streaming app as well. Also, if you did not get a chance to already, you can go to HIFF.org on the Spotlights page under Film for Thought section, and you can read a companion essay written by Danielle for this film. So if you want to, just engage in some more, thinking and about this topic and this film, please definitely check out that essay. And last but not least, I do want to remind everyone, we have a wonderful panel series coming up this week. It's called The Way Forward, Race and Reckoning in Hawaii, Conversations on Race and Reckoning in Hawaii. And Ursula will be participating in a panel, which is also co-presented as part of this program. And it is called Mixed Plate, Hapa and Mixed Ethnic Representation in Film. It's going to be a wonderful panel discussion. It's completely free, and that is on Thursday at noon Hawaii time. So definitely check that out, as well as the other conversations as part of that series. It's going to be really amazing and engaging series this week. I think that's all for my many housekeeping bits and announcements today, but another big mahalo to Danielle Seed and Ursula Liang. Thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.